Good morning. Good morning. We're just getting logged on to Quizlet. Good morning. We are getting on to Quizlet. We're going to practice probably 3 times. Like I said earlier, I added almost all of your test questions to this except for 2. I'll be adding the other 2 today after today's lesson. I'm also going to be adding a link to this because there is like a flashcard practice with this as well. And I'll show you guys how to access that after we play. But so that way you guys can practice before you take your test. Natalie, you're on for twice. Which one's wrong? The one with the capital N or the lowercase n? Because it'll still put you in a team. So your quiz is 10 questions. It's open already. It closes on Friday. It's over chapters 1 through 4. There's 5 multiple choice questions and 5 short answer questions. The short answer question should be in complete sentences. You only get 1 attempt at the quiz and you get 60 minutes to take it. Of course, it is open book, open notes. And like I said, I'm going to post this on there, and this has all 10 questions hidden in it somewhere. Sam, are you on yet?
Yeah.
Okay. And we are going to be playing in groups today, so I need everyone to make sure they have their masks on and they're distancing appropriately. You guys can move. Anissa is online, so Susan and Natalie, yeah, she's online. But she is here. If you guys want to move, you can.
Oh, so sorry. All of our is not still realistic. Representation. Yeah.
Yeah, oh, got it. Oh, you did it?
Their date or July. Yeah.
Susan and Natalie, if you guys want to come up here, she can hear you. But you got to come closer.
No, I don't. Okay, she has one color.
Okay, any
Representational.
can she talk?
Yeah.
Yeah, I chose warm colors for that one. It just hasn't changed on my end.
How do you know who has the?
We all have the same question,
But
it's just
different.
different answers. What are your answers?
It's still, what question are the one, any work of art that seeks to resemble the world of natural appearance, right?
Yeah, what are your answer choices, Anissa?
Representational art, art as contemporary, warm colors, and art as commemoration.
Representational? Can you click representational art?
Okay.
Outside orders?
Yeah,
Oh, there you went.
there you went.
It's okay, we're going to play again.
Okay.
Okay, so this,
Do you have outside artists as one of your?
No.
Oh, that's a painting.
Sure.
Artifact.
Is it that
okay,
What are your answer choices?
Art for self-expression, medium, art in worship and ritual, and then chiaroscuro.
It's medium.
art then
Art of delight.
yeah, did you have art?
what?
Okay.
Yeah.
That is like commemoration,
Oh,
or as commentary?
no.
No, is it the other one?
What art do you have?
I have art for persuasion and abstract art.
I think it's artist.
I thought it was called.
Blue, green, and
And then
violet
I have a lot of
colors.
yes. I know.
Do you have medium?
Yes.
That's art is worship.
Well, you weren't loud,
Right?
you were in the middle.
That's, isn't that aesthetic?
No. Oh, yeah. A particular.
It's Isn't that the medium?
Yeah, what's your,
Do you have a medium?
Yes.
Blue, green, and violet are the cool colors.
anyone that thinks of
Natural appearance is the artist.
representation?
Is it?
He's had all. And then,
And-
art and visual.
Do you have outside artists?
Yes.
Enhance religious.
What arts do you have?
Art and worship and ritual. Is it that one?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's
Creativity?
I have commemoration, art for commemoration.
example. These guys are, this guy is.
Oh, that, we just did that one. Was it persuasion? Yeah.
The memory.
You guys are close. Okay, we have time for one more round.
Okay, art of commentary.
Let's see. Enhance religious contemplation.
Do you have the worship art?
Yes.
Protection of material.
Medium.
Medium.
That was, what?
Isn't that creativity?
Iconography?
Is it?
I have aesthetic.
I know, I don't think it's that.
The Tree of Life.
Oh,
Abstract.
abstract art.
And you're an artist, yeah, so you.
Red, orange, and yellow.
Yeah,
The natural appearance is,
Representational?
I think,
Red, orange, yellow.
isn't that commentary?
I have that one. Do you think that's one it?
Writing information, that's commentary. Okay.
No.
Oh, no, transportational, like you said.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
The red, orange, and yellow is the one color.
Art of commentary. No, persuasion. Do you have persuasion?
Yes.
Enhance religious,
Commentary. Interpretation of these.
Peacock's just chilling right now. Thanks.
visuals and.
I don't know that one. What are your answers to this?
I have art for self-expression and medium.
Okay, so it's either iconography or that last one, but I don't know what that last one is.
I think this one.
Art of beauty,
The art of beauty isn't that. Art is the light.
commentary, no, aesthetic.
Aesthetic. Oh, no. Oh, I picked the wrong one.
Okay. Thank you, Peacocks. And good job. Okay, like I said, I'm gonna add the last two questions to that today. But if you go, when I send the link to the front page, there's a flashcard study option. It works just like flashcards do, they flip over. So yeah, great practice. I think some of you understand the areas where you might want to work a bit yet. Yeah. Any questions about the quiz? No. Yeah, it's 60 minutes. But
And these flashcards are the, like, what would be the not accepted to you?
yeah, and I'll add those. Any other questions? Remember, you only get one attempt, but because I have had this happen a few times and the internet around campus has been very sketchy the last few days, if you get kicked out, just email me and I will reopen it for you as quickly as possible. If you text me, I will get it reopened even faster. I don't check my emails all that often. It's every few hours. Text messages I receive immediately. But yeah. moving on. Did I close the presentation of it? Okay, I was gonna say what? So Thursday, we talked about the different aspects that go into creating an artwork. Today, we're going to be discussing the different principles of design, also known as the different principles of composition. Can you see this presentation, Anissa?
Can you put it back to like where it's just the screen? I mean, I see you.
Okay. Okay, now you should see it.
Yes, now I see.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, just let me know. But to understand what we're talking about, for starters, we need to understand what I'm talking about when I'm referring to a composition. For some reason, it dawned on me finally after teaching this for like 4 years that someone might not know what that word means. And I asked my first hour, and sure enough, there were a bunch of people that didn't know what a composition was. So another word for composition when referring to a painting or a photograph or a drawing would be a layout or a plan. So those words can all be used interchangeably. Artists try to come up with compositions or plans that will best suit the idea that they're trying to achieve with their artwork. So all of these principles that we're going to be discussing today are the different things that artists will think about before they actually make the artwork. The different steps per se that an artist might go over. It's important to keep in mind though that it's not like a checklist. Artists are very free flowing people. Checklists aren't really for them. They're quite constrictive. These are things that they automatically are just trained to consider before diving into making an artwork. Of course, it's not just a one and done either. If you remember our principles of creativity, the last one is experimenting. This is the experimenting stage when we're designing. The principles of designing are all about experimenting and trying things out. Oftentimes artists will end up changing their compositions or plans partway through because they decide they don't like that one. So that experiment failed. If you ever do a little research on the Mona Lisa and understand the when they go and look at the underpaintings and what is underneath it, you can see Da Vinci's old compositions, the ones that didn't quite make the cut. So artists will change their plans partway through, and it's all about experimenting and trying things out. Some artists will take into account all of the principles of design that we're going to be discussing today. Some will not. You do not have to use all of them. You can only just use a couple if you want. It just depends on the artist, their style, the time period that we're talking about. So if we're talking about Renaissance art, they're probably going to be using all of them. If we're talking about modern art, they're probably not. They don't care much about certain things, not like the Renaissance artists did. But let's go ahead and get started with some vocabulary terms to start us off. Terms that we're going to come across today are asymmetrical balance. Asymmetrical balance means that a painting is balanced but not perfectly symmetrical. Directional forces are lines that draw our eye to a specific focal point. A focal point is the main point of a picture. Scale is the size of something in relation to something else. And symmetrical balance is a near perfect balance or exact balance. Today is a pretty simple lecture. It's just going to be going over the different principles and looking at examples. So if you remember the lecture over the purposes or functions of art, it's about like that. So we list a principle and then look at different examples and discuss those examples and whether they work or not. Okay, so last week we talked about several reasons why artists create art. Yes, ma'am. Oh yeah, you want me to go back? No problem. Last week we talked about reasons why artists create art. Does anyone remember some of the purposes for creating art? Delight. What's another? Commemoration. Very good. And what's one more? Persuasion. So that's 3 of the 6. You might want to remember the other 3 as well at some point. Hopefully before you take your test. Those are the why artists create art. Today is the how artists create art. Tomorrow we're going to be discussing how critics look at art. So we're going to be taking a shift tomorrow from the artist's perspective to a viewer's perspective. And then after that, we'll go over mediums. But we're finally moving into the how artists create art territory today. Of course, the first thing an artist takes into account, specifically a 2D artist, is composition, although I would argue most 3D artists also consider compositions before they design something. And design is just a fancy term that encompasses all art. Like I said, a composition is just a plan or a layout. Of course, both of those terms have to deal with the way an artist organizes their artwork. So if you're trying to think of a more layman's way of titling today's section, you could title it The Principles of Organization as far as an artwork, if that's easier to understand. Of course, when people are organizing things, everyone does things differently, right? People don't organize things exactly the same. Artists are the same way. Every artist will organize different things different ways. And here's a quote from the artist Roy Lichtenstein. Organized perception is what art is all about. So the idea that we are perceiving some sort of an organized design or composition is the end result that we're all looking at, and the end result that all artists are trying to achieve. But like I mentioned, artists have different ways of organizing. They aren't all doing it the same way. Roy Lichtenstein had a very different take on how to organize his artworks. He decided to be heavily influenced by comic books. So here's a Roy Lichtenstein painting, Drowning Girl. Obviously, like I said, references heavily comic books and comic book strips, so much so that if we were to see this painting in person, we would notice that it is not so much a painting as a bunch of dots. Those dots are called Ben-Day dots. So if you ever get the chance to see a Roy Lichtenstein up close, you'll know it's a really large painting with just teeny tiny little polka dots. So if you've ever seen an old-fashioned comic book, the way it's printed is with those polka dots, the colored dots. Lichtenstein copied that, but he did his dots by hand instead of with a printer. So a little bit different there. So he borrowed from the composition of comic books in order to compose his artworks. He also here decided to create a layout in which, of course, this woman is the main focal point. One of the reasons we can tell she's the main focal point is because all the swirling water eventually leads us to her. He actually copied Fibonacci sequence for this one. Does anyone know what Fibonacci sequence is? So it's the idea of the shape that is most pleasing to people's eyes aesthetically being that. Basically the shape of a shell. And it's actually a whole bunch of like series of mathematical numbers and stuff that you can use to figure it out. We don't do math in here though, I don't like math. But yeah, if you're interested in that, there's a whole bunch of scientific studies about that particular shape as well as other shapes and which ones are most pleasing to people's eyes. During the Renaissance period, people thought that triangles were aesthetically pleasing. During the Art Nouveau period, people thought S shapes were pleasing. And then nowadays people think that that is pleasing to look at. So this particular composition is in your little spiral shape. And he says like, what? Fibonacci sequence is just a spiral. And you can kind of see that spiral here. So that was very complex as far as analyzing a composition. But today what we're going to be doing is breaking down each of those principles that go into designing those plans or organizing those plans one by one and look at different examples, starting with the first one, unity and variety. Then we'll move on to balance, emphasis and subordination, directional forces, contrast, repetition, rhythm, and scale and proportion. And once again, keep in mind, it's not some checklist that an artist goes through and they don't use all of them at all times. Starting with unity and variety. So if you didn't get all of those bullet points, they're going to be listed like this as we go throughout. So it's pretty easy to categorize things. But before we get into this, what is another word for unity? Together, cohesiveness, things that work together, look similar, look the same. What about variety?
Option.
Options, very good. Can you have unity and variety at the same time?
Yeah.
Probably, yeah. We're going to be looking at examples of artworks that both use unity and variety and sometimes at the same time. And then we're going to look at an artwork that is a complete opposite example of all of those things. So like I said, unity is another word for something being cohesive or one. For today's presentation, I did not use the examples from your book. I instead chose examples from the Fort Worth Modern Museum, so you can go see these in a day trip fairly easily if you're interested in seeing them in person. A few of them are not from the Fort Worth Modern. I'll point out which ones. But almost all of them are. And I also chose extraordinarily obvious examples when going through this particular section. So here we have Yves Klein's IKB Got It. Don't think too hard. How is this an example of unity?
All one.
It's all one color. Very good. My first morning class, they sat there for a long time. I'm like, dude. How more obvious can you get? I think last week I mentioned a painting that was all blue that was worth like a few million. This is it. Yep, this is it. IKB actually stands for Yves Klein Blue. Some countries spell his name with an I instead of a Y. It's a shade of blue that he actually patented and owns the rights to. His favorite color is blue. He paints everything in blue. In fact, his entire portfolio could be considered a great example of unity because everything's blue. It's all the same shade of blue. Every artwork he did in his career is blue. And he made a lot of money off of it. And this is one of them. Another Yves Klein, People Begin to Fly. How is this one an example of unity? Kind of. You're thinking too hard. Huh? So it's unified with the background being white and the foreground being blue. What about the subject matter?
People.
It's all people. So it's all blue, it's all people. So that is one way it's unity. How is there variety? Very good. They're in different poses and different positions. We're actually going to watch a little short video now of how he made these paintings, because he made quite a few. Of course, it was pretty easy to make them. You'll see why I said that in a second. But yeah, very interesting fellow, very absurd time in history. I have to reshare this for Nisa so she can see it. Okay. Nisa, you should see a YouTube screen right now.
Yes.
So this is a particular show that was recorded for a gallery. Yves Klein was invited to go and paint live for the gallery show. It's a big to-do. Normal gallery shows don't have orchestras.
The late Czechoslovakian painter Yves Klein is
Oh, and this is supposed to be humorous, so it's okay to laugh. My first hour also did not understand that.
The music inspires. These models, covering themselves with paint, are the human brushes with which Klein will give form and color to his creative feeling. As some of you may have guessed, Klein's favorite color is blue. Blue is also his favorite form. As a matter of fact, blue is his only form and his only color. Blue are his paintings, for which there is a great demand. Blue is the work toward which our camera is moving, considered by many authoritative critics as the greatest Klein masterpiece, and from which the expert can readily deduct that blue is the dominant color. Dripping blue, the human paintbrushes go and leave their imprints on the canvas, while Klein guides them from far off with the flow of his creative genius.
So this one's a little different than the one in the picture, as the one in the picture was airbrushed around the women. This one is just the women. This one is slightly more famous than the one that's at the Fort Worth Modern.
phase of whose creation we have had the privilege of recording on film is on sale for only 4 million francs.
It's worth way more than 4 million today. But yeah, that was while he was still alive. Now he's dead. So it's worth a lot more. So yeah, fun little example of unity and variety there. Let's get back there. Okay, moving on, another example of unity and variety, not quite so absurd, still weird. This is the artwork of Bern and Hilla Becker, a husband and wife duo that go around and take pictures of water towers. Every single photograph is the same size. They would be in a 3x3 gallery hanging in a museum. So of course, multiple pictures of water towers, with 9 of them in total. So how would this be an example of unity?
Same object,
Do what? Sorry.
the same object.
Same object, yeah. So it's all a water tower. What else? Black and white photograph, yes. And what else? The last one has to do with, size, yes. So size, they're all exactly the same size, and there's one other, and it has to do with placement. They're all in the middle. Now, how's the variety? They're all different, and there's another way that there is variety as well.
The background.
The background. So there's unity and variety working together. If this was a photograph of the same exact water tower over and over and over, that'd be dumb. Although I can't say much for that because this is just blue paintings over and over and over. But sometimes having too much unity can get a bit boring. So variety helps to spice things up a bit. As we've already determined, you can have unity and variety at the same time. So here, this particular print is not at the Fort Worth Modern because it's too old to be there. Anything at the Fort Worth Modern has to be made post 1945. This was 1900. But this is Alphonse Mucha's The Precious Stones series. How do we have some variety here? Colors, what else? Poses, yes. What else? Sure. Yeah, technically no, but yeah, they all look different. It's all the same model, Sarah Bernhardt, who was a famous actress. But all of the poses and the stylings are so different that it looks like a different woman. What'd you say back there, Natalie? Oh yeah, yeah. You're moving on to unity, but yeah. So they all have flowers. The flowers are different, but they all have flowers in the foreground. In the midground, they have the woman. The women, all of them are wearing flowing garments. And then in the background, they all have the little medallion. Of course, different designs. So they're all very unified and cohesive and they go together, but there is variety in between them. And of course, that's because Mucha was trying to represent different precious stones in like personified forms. So any guesses as to which stone this one's supposed to represent? A ruby. What about this one? Amethyst? Emerald? And I can't remember the yellow one, so Huh? Topaz. That's what I said earlier and I wasn't sure, but I think it's topaz. And nobody first hour could remember what yellow was either. I guess yellow is just not important as far as color in stone. But of course you have the poinsettia for the ruby. This woman is wearing red and her background is also red, helping to easily differentiate who is who, while still being a series that works together. And he does a lot like this. He's done some for the seasons. So all of the women look like they go together, but they're all representing the different seasons of the year. She also did one for night and day too. And this is an Art Nouveau work. Earlier I mentioned that during the Art Nouveau period, it was an S curvilinear shape that was considered precious to look at. And here is our S being used in the body shapes of these women. And here's another example of variety. How is there variety in this painting? Yes. So the tints and shades are blacks, grays, and whites. So there is some unity going on as well as variety there because there are different shades of those. There's also unity because it is an achromatic painting. There are no colors used, only hues and tints, or not hues, shades and tints. How else is there variety though? The sizes, yes, very good. What about the floor?
Contrast.
Oh yeah, we're going to talk about contrast later. We'll get to contrast. How is there variety in this one? The shapes, yes. How else is there variety? Colors. How is there unity? They're all geometric shapes. Last Thursday we learned there's 3 kinds of shapes. These are geometric shapes. And of course you could also argue that there's unity because they're all painted one solid color. By the way, both of these are at the Fort Worth Modern. Ellsworth Kelly actually had to hand make his own canvas frames and stretch his own canvas because these are not normal shapes that people will sell. And then, of course, in opposition to unity and variety, there is complete disorder, usually seen in abstract art like the works of Pollock or Joan Mitchell here. Usually casually applied brushstrokes are seen with complete disorder. There's not really any unity or variety. Well, there's a lot of variety, but not really any cohesiveness. If you're thinking Joan Mitchell's artwork looks very similar to Jackson Pollock's, that's because they were married. That takes us into balance. With balance, there's both symmetrical balance and asymmetrical balance. Symmetrical balance is really easy for people to understand. Asymmetrical balance is where people struggle. I don't understand why, but I guess because it's not like a outright rule system and it's more like psychologically in our mind things are balanced or not balanced. It's not quite literal, and people that tend to think more literally struggle with asymmetrical balance a bit more. So for symmetry, our first example is Mark Rothko here. Just a reminder, symmetry is when things are balanced equally throughout the picture plane. So would you say this is a balanced painting?
So,
Why?
I mean, if you were to imagine it as a brick, they would die.
So what I like to think is if we were to cut this in half, would it be identical on each side? Yeah. Does that always work with symmetry? No. But it's the easiest way to tell if something's symmetrical or not. Now, if we were to cut this horizontally, would it be balanced? Why? Because there's white on the bottom. Very good. Very good. I didn't even have to tell you guys. You did good on Thursday. You remember Thursday's colors lesson, because sometimes that's usually where people struggle with symmetry and asymmetry is with the colors. But you guys are already there. Of course, you would never ever want to cut a Mark Rothko in half. You'd be taking a big deficit. Because this one's worth more than Yves Klein's blue painting. You'd be losing a lot of money.
What's the target value? Like what makes that
Critics, which is what we're talking about tomorrow. We're going to be talking about art critics tomorrow, specifically. So it's the art critics that help to determine whether or not an artist is going to be successful. During this period of time, the 50s and 60s, a particular art critic named Clement Greenberg was really popular, and whatever he said was like law. So if he went to your art show and said, oh, you're going to be an amazing up and coming artist, then collectors will immediately start snatching up all of your artworks, raising the valuation, because you have to follow the idea of supply and demand. The more people are demanding your art, the more expensive it's going to be, which is another reason why I said Yves Klein's paintings, now that he's dead, are worth a lot more, because he's not making any more. The supply has gone down, but the demand is still there. The art market is literally all about supply and demand. And a lot of people invest in artwork because the values don't usually drop. It's a pretty steady investment, like stock markets. So wealthy people, and this is something I don't usually mention, wealthy people will buy up and invest in art like they would property or stocks. They don't actually buy art to enjoy it. They buy it to collect it and store it, and then later on sell it for more value and try and make money off of it. So oftentimes most of the art that's ever made in the world is actually in a storehouse, not out on display. There's tons and tons of warehouses dedicated just to storing artworks that people have collected. And they're just there, sitting in the dark, wasting away until the person is like, okay, we need to sell this because it's worth more money now. It's literally the stock market just with stuff that you can actually see. And like I said, it's those art critics that drive that demand. If an art critic comes to your show and says your artwork is not worth anyone going to see it, then nobody's going to invest in it. But if an art critic says, oh, this is an amazing show of an up and coming artist, then all of a sudden people are going to want to buy your stuff.
How does art critic go up to that painting and just say it's going to be worth money?
That was Clement Greenberg. So he was a strange person. I have a cat here in my nose. Sorry. I adopted a kitten over the weekend, and yeah. So it was a strange time post World War II in which people wanted abstract things instead of realistic things, and the more absurd something was, the more popular it was. That was just the culture and the trends of that time. We're going to talk a lot more in depth about what happened post World War II when we're going over the art history section. But prior to World War II, there was a lot of realism, and then all of a sudden, people just didn't want that anymore. They wanted something different and new, and they wanted to push the boundaries of what they could do with art. And people like these art critics like Greenberg also wanted something different. So that's why things like that all blue painting became really popular, even though it's kind of stupid, unless you really like the color blue, I guess. Yeah, we're going to be talking about that a lot later on in art history, but that's a good point to bring up. Any other questions about things like that? A little side note, but it's not a bad one. And it's kind of my favorite thing to talk about because that's what I went to school for. But yeah, I went to school because I wanted to be an art critic and like work on buying and selling art. I don't do that. I like talking about it more, but yeah. Moving on to symmetry still. This is Martin Puryear's ladder for Booker T. Washington. Another example, if you were to divide this in half, it's going to be balanced. A ladder is a ladder. If you cut a ladder in half, it's going to be pretty similar on each side. Of course, this one's got zigzags, but if you put them on top of each other, they're going to be identical because it's a ladder. It's kind of interesting that I chose this one. I don't usually talk about it too much, but since yesterday was Martin Luther King Day, kind of on point with that particular holiday as well as other topics around the world today. Does anyone know who Booker T. Washington is? Really important African American historical figure. Well, if you ever take an African American history class, which I recommend because you'll learn a whole lot and it'll be very eye-opening, you'll come across Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington, for the good majority of his life, was a slave. However, the Civil War came along, and of course, he ended up a free man. And as soon as he became a free man, he argued that in order for African Americans to truly be free and equal to their white counterparts, they needed to have equal opportunities of education. So he made it his lifelong mission to build colleges and universities for African Americans to attend. Because if you remember anything about Civil War history, things were segregated and African Americans weren't allowed to go to universities and colleges for a really long time afterwards. So he made African American colleges for them to attend so they could do something beyond just working in fields. So they could get business degrees, work as government officials and things like that. So why do you think Martin Puryear chose to use a ladder to illustrate that? Yeah, so they're climbing the ladder, trying to reach that equality. But what's going on with that ladder?
It's wavy.
It's wavy, and what else? Huh? So the reason it looks like that is because it looks like it's supposed to never end. They have a really, really bright light in that gallery on the top to make it look like it just keeps going on forever, like infinity. A mirror probably would have been really good to use too. But it's wavy to show that the path isn't straight. It's going to be a struggle to climb up it. And it looks like it never ends because really they should never stop trying to better themselves in society, is what Martin Puryear and Booker T. Washington were all about. Never stop trying to strive towards success is basically what this artwork is about. And Martin Puryear is a really, really popular artist right now. As far as collectors, everyone wants to collect his artworks. Famous African American artist, and he does woodworking, mostly because his father taught him how to do it, but also because wood is a traditional African medium to use in creating art. So he's going back to his roots there. But that's a long little side trip, and I felt like taking it because it kind of fit yesterday. Talking about him very much, he's one of my favorites. Cornelia Parker's Endless Column 1. This is 14 silver objects that she's crushed with an industrial press and nailed to the floor. So this artwork is actually on the floor. You walk around it. How is this symmetrical?
Well, if you cut it in half,
Yeah.
it'd be the same.
Yeah, it's the same on each side. Of course, don't always cut things in half. But yeah, it's the same on each side. Now we're getting into asymmetry. which is a lot more complex. You have to understand, like Natalie mentioned earlier, that white doesn't have any weight, black has a lot of weight. And of course, asymmetrical balance is not perfectly balanced. It's just really well balanced. So this is more of a psychological balance effect than a literal one, which is why I said people tend to struggle with this one a little bit more because people see things differently. But this one, we would not want to cut it in half. It will never ever balance out if you cut it in half. This one's composition is actually on a diagonal, which I think you can probably see. So Ed Ruscha has created a diagonal composition in which the lower left-hand triangle here has the subject matter, whereas the upper right-hand triangle is just a solid mass of blue with a 10-cent stamp. So this is considered asymmetrically balanced because blue has more mass than white. That's literally it. Blue also has more mass than red, technically, but this is a slightly darker red than this light blue, so that kind of helps balance things a little bit more. So this is considered asymmetrically balanced due to the color choices that the artist used. Like I said, asymmetry is not perfectly balanced. It's not identical on each side. It's just almost balanced or to where the composition seems balanced psychologically in our heads. So thanks to Ruscha choosing to make a solid triangle of blue, it helps to balance the weight of the other corner. Will I ever show you a picture and say, is this symmetrically balanced or asymmetrically balanced? No, that's very mean. As far as these go, if you remember the definitions, you should be fine. Asymmetry is something that takes a lot of training to figure out how to understand. I like to think of asymmetry more when I'm doing like home decor though. Like for example, you could have one tall object on one side, let's say a candlestick, and a vase on the other side that is the same height. They are not identical, but they're the same mass as far as the space they take up. So asymmetry, it's not identical on each side, but it takes up the same amount of mass. I'm trying to think of stuff in here that I could do that with, but that's too much work right now. When I'm thinking of like my entertainment center at home, I have a candlestick on one side and a vase on the other side. They're the same height, but they're different shapes, but they take up the same amount of space. Here's another example of asymmetry. Here we have Clyfford Still's Untitled. So if we divide this one in half, we have a solid patch of mustardy yellow, and on the other side we have whites and blacks. Once again, white has no mass, black has a lot of mass. So this one is asymmetrically balanced due to color choices. Once again, usually if we're looking at a painting and it's asymmetrically balanced, it probably has to do with color choices. Us to emphasis and subordination. Congratulations, we have passed the hard one. Asymmetry is the hardest thing we're talking about today. Emphasis and subordination just means what is the artist trying to emphasize and what is the artist trying to deter you from. So what's important and what's not. Here's a hint, usually if it's in the background, it's not important or not as important. So for emphasis and subordination, we're going to look at a painting by Lavinia Fontana, also not in the Fort Worth Modern because it was done a really, really, really long time ago in the 1500s. Here is that painting. It is Noli me tangere, which translates to do not touch me. It is the story of Mary Magdalene from the Bible. If you remember, Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. So it makes sense that she wouldn't want Christ to touch her because she was sinful. And that's what's being illustrated here is Christ meeting Mary Magdalene. And then in the background here, we have the story of when Mary Magdalene and the other women go to Christ's tomb to find it empty. So which part is Lavinia Fontana trying to emphasize here? Which part of the story? Yes. So the story of Mary meeting Christ, the story in the foreground is where she's placing emphasis. This is our focal point. The background has been subordinated. It's not as important. You can also tell by size. We're also going to be talking about size when we get to scale. That takes us into directional forces. That also goes on with emphasis and subordination. Directional forces are lines that the artists have included that help guide our eye to the focal points. So if you remember Francisco Goya's 3rd of May, the dude with the white shirt, all of the guns were pointing to him. Those guns were directional forces leading our eye to him. For directional forces, I've chosen 2 paintings from the Romantic period of art, also from a while ago, the 1800s, actually might be 1700s for these. Romantic art is not romantic. Romantic art is about current events. And here is the first one, Eugene Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. Now, before I say anything at all, what is the focal point, or who is the focal point? The lady. See, it didn't take too much effort or background and knowledge to understand what the focal point is. Part of that being because obviously she is the largest figure and in the center of the composition, but also, in case you couldn't figure that out, almost all of the lines in the painting point to her. So the flag leads down to her, this man's gun leads to her, this man's eyesight goes to her, this boy's arm goes to her, this dude's naked body goes to her. Just to emphasize who the important person in this composition is. Of course, this is a painting done to celebrate the French Revolution. Lady Liberty is being personified here as a female figure. Liberty representing freedom, freedom from tyranny and freedom from monarchy. These guys in the background are victorious. And of course, the naked man is actually supposed to be an aristocrat, which is why he's naked, because they lost and these people did not like the aristocracy at the time. If you know anything about the French Revolution, you'd understand why, but you don't really need to for this class. Here's another romantic painting. What is the focal point? You mean this one? Yeah. So once again, almost all of the lines, all of these people, their outstretched arms are going towards him. All of the people on the side also body-wise go towards him as composition. The flag up top is where the artist is trying to lead our eye, because in the distance there is a ship and they're trying to signal it. So this is the Raft of the Medusa, which was an actual ship. The Medusa sank in a bad storm and shipwrecked, and the crew tried to live on a raft for a very long period of time. Most of them died. The ones that survived had to resort to cannibalism to live. Gericault read about the story in the newspaper and decided to illustrate it in a painting. Like I said, they're trying to signal that ship in the distance, which is an itty bitty little speck right here on the horizon line. So romantic paintings are not romantic. They're about current events. It's a very misleading title. Romantic paintings were very popular in the 1800s because they followed the Academy's rules. So Matthew earlier was asking about why art critics had so much power in determining the valuation of art. That's new. It used to be in the 1800s that the Academy determined who is successful and not, the Academy being the School of Arts. If you went to the School of Arts and they said you were a good artist, you were successful. If you went to the School of Arts and they said you were a bad artist, you were not successful. And then, of course, before the School of Arts was the church. The church determined who was popular and who wasn't. So things change over time, depending on what time period we're talking about. That takes us into contrast. Contrasts are two opposing forces put near each other. So earlier when Brandon was talking about the Innis painting and he's talking about the floor and how it contrasted the painting itself, and I told him to wait because we're talking about contrast. This is that point, which the floor did contrast that painting really well. So two opposing forces mean two things that you wouldn't normally put together or don't look like they belong together. For this one, I chose something a little bit more abstract to look at, not an abstract art piece, but abstract to think about as far as contrast. Not quite literal. I mean, I think it's pretty literal, but people struggle with it. It's not a painting, it's a sculpture. And it is Joseph Havel's drape. What is a drape usually made of?
Linen, cloth.
Cloth, fabric. Does it move?
Yeah.
Yes, cloth fabric is movable. This particular sculpture is made of bronze. Does bronze move?
No.
No. So what are the two contrasting things here? Yes. So the name itself suggests something that should be soft and malleable. It should move and flow, but the material contrasts that title because it is quite solid and hard and immovable. There's something else in this painting though, well not this painting, this photograph, that can be referred to as contrast, and that is the background. And I say that because every time I show this image, for some reason, and this is the only semester this has not happened, but people always talk about the background. And that is because of the glass wall juxtaposed with the concrete wall. Concrete being very solid, sturdy, dense, glass being lightweight and see-through. So very, very different as far as contrasting each other. And this particular artwork is once again in the Fort Worth Modern. The museum itself was designed by a famous artist. And I recommend you take the time to check out that museum because it looks like it's floating, which is really cool. Or at least look at pictures of it online because it looks really interesting. So I do let them, when they bring up the background, to talk about it because technically the building itself is an art piece. Then to repetition and rhythm, which is very, very easy to comprehend. Repetition and rhythm is similar things over and over again, such as with a comic book or a comic strip. You see the same character over and over again as they go throughout the story. There's repetition in seeing that character again and again and again. Some quite literal examples of repetition and rhythm. We have Jenny Holzer's Kind of Blue. We looked at Jenny Holzer on Thursday as well when we were looking at movement. She had the ticker tape that went around the Guggenheim Museum. This is another one, which is 9 LED signs, which say the same sentence going over and over again in repetition. So besides the sentences going over and over again nonstop, how else is it repetitive?
Order.
The ordering, yeah. What else? I like to add that one, but nobody ever mentions it. So the glass, this is once again in that same museum. The glass overlooks the lake and the letters themselves look like they're flowing into the lake, which is really cool. It's not really super repetitive or repetition, but it looks really cool to look at. So it's repetitive in the fact that it's multiples. It's all the same font, same text, same color, very much the same over and over again. Another example of repetition, how is this repetitive? It's the same box over and over again, yeah. So this is a Donald Judd. Donald Judd is a minimalist artist. They were all about minimalism, which you can kind of see here. He did boxes, mostly steel boxes. This is the steel box with plexiglass over top. All the same size, same dimension, very much so because he had them manufactured and mass produced. So they are identical. A machine pumped it out. A human did not make this. Also, millionaire. If you ever go to Marfa and the Chinati Foundation, I recommend you doing that. He purchased a large piece of land near Marfa called Chinati Foundation, and inside of it, there's a lot of other minimalist artworks as well as other artworks and a lot of Donald Judd's. And I actually appreciate Donald Judd's artworks at that location versus in like a sterile gallery setting a little bit more, because they reflect the landscape around them really well. And another example of repetition and rhythm, not quite so literal. We have a hand scroll here. This hand scroll is, of course, rolled up, and you would unroll it and read it from right to left. And this hand scroll tells the story of the contest between the rabbit and the frog. So you see the same characters, the rabbit and the frog, as they go throughout their contest. So there's repetition in the sense of the characters popping up again and again as you scroll through it. And our last principle of design is scale and proportion. That's the size of things in relation to other things. Sometimes scale and proportion is very realistic. So if you look back or think back to a smoke backstage, which was the pipe, matches, and tobacco and newspaper painting, all of those were very proportionate. They're very realistic. The scale and sizes matched each other. Sometimes artists will do scales and proportions that are not realistic, such as with Giotto's Madonna painting here. This is an example of something called hierarchic scale, which will pop up a few times in this class. That's the idea that you make something really big if it's more important. So the biggest person in the painting is usually the most important. The smallest person is the least important. So sometimes scale can help viewers determine who's the important person and who's not, which is exactly what's happening here. Let's see if we can remember our iconography. Who knows who this lady is in the blue? Mary, and who's on her left? Jesus. So Mary is obviously a giant in comparison to the angels and to the saints around her. Obviously, in real life, Mary was not a giant. But Giotto didn't know how else to portray Mary as the most important figure without making her look big. This is early Renaissance. People didn't quite comprehend how to do that yet. During the High Renaissance, they'll figure out how to show who's who without making them look like they're giants. That comes right after Giotto, though. Unfortunately, he missed out on that one. Another example of scale and proportion, the Madonna with the long neck. This is post-Renaissance during something called the Mannerist period, in which they purposefully messed with scale and proportion to create very odd and confusing compositions. Anyone see anything in there that looks off?
The little sound.
This one? So he's super, super small in comparison to her. That's one. What else? There's a whole bunch. Huh? Her laugh is huge, especially in comparison to her head. Her head is teeny tiny and her laugh is giant. Christ himself is huge, really, really long baby there. We're going to watch a little video for a couple minutes, and this is the last thing we're doing today about this painting because it's a really odd painting and we don't get to talk about it in this class at all.
Here we're looking at the great Mannerist painting by Parmigianino called The Madonna with the Long Neck. It's a fun painting.
And it's a tall painting. It's a big
It's
painting.
big, and Madonna is big. She's big in funny places too. If you look at her head is really tiny.
Compared to her hips especially.
Right, she's got really, really wide hips. And then she comes down on these tiny little toes. So it's always seemed to me like her body is in the shape of a diamond.
In a sense, she's a landscape on which Christ sits.
Christ himself is also quite large.
It's not just large, but look at the way he splays his body. There's this crazy kind of torsion with his arm falling almost dislocated from the shoulder.
There is a precedent for that way that his left arm falls down. If you think about Michelangelo's Pietà and Christ here as a child, but perhaps echoing when Mary will hold Christ in images like the Pietà when Christ is dead. And in fact, Christ looks asleep, but there's also a way that he looks dead too.
So that reference actually in some ways explains the mass of her laugh, because in that sculpture, Mary is quite substantial in order to be able to support the dead body of her son.
It's so clear when we're looking at this that we're not in the High Renaissance anymore.
So what happened?
Yeah, Mannerism happened. It's almost like the artists of the High Renaissance had done everything that could be done. They had perfected the naturalism that they had sought after since the time of Giotto.
So all of the illusionism that was at the service of the High Renaissance is here being used to distort and to transform the body. It's not so much an ugly deformation as a kind of deformation that accentuates a kind of extreme elegance.
Exactly. It takes that ideal beauty and elegance that was in the High Renaissance, that was there, and exaggerates it. And one way of thinking about Mannerism is to think about it as art taken from art, instead of art from nature. You know, we think about the Renaissance as being based on observation of nature and the natural world. But when you look at this, you think back to works of art like Michelangelo's Giuliano de' Medici and that long neck, or back to the Pietà.
That makes a lot of sense, the idea that this is art that is self-referential, that is referring to its own traditions.
The respect for human anatomy and portraying that naturalistically, not important manners. In fact, I think there's a letter from one Mannerist artist to another Mannerist artist where he says something like, take a left hand and put it on a right arm. It's like there's a willful complicating of the body.
And setting up relationships between forms that are absurd. Look at the relationship between the vase that's being held by the angel in relationship to her thigh. Look at the relationship between the massive Virgin Mary and the prophet in the lower right corner that is presumably impossibly far away, but somehow just a tiny figure at the feet of the Virgin.
And look too at the way that the Virgin holds her hand to her chest with these impossibly long, almost boneless fingers. There's a way in which the gesture fails to mean anything.
It means gesture,
yeah, and drama.
As opposed to a specific intent of the figure.
Yeah, there's a kind of dramatizing here.
For its own sake.
Exactly.
For its own sake. Or that kind of willful compression that creates a sense of almost the impossible. If you look at the columns on the right, there's actually a colonnade that is so deep in space, it's seen at such an oblique angle that it almost seems like a wall or a single column. But if you look closely at the base, you can see the alternating light and shadow that passes between those columns. But there is ambiguity, and that's in large part because that part of the painting is not finished. So Mannerism seems to be this intense reaction to the perfection of the High Renaissance. You know, you have the Renaissance, in a sense, building itself into a kind of extreme naturalism, and then it seems to be almost a kind of flailing reaction against those strictures.
Or a sense that there was nowhere to go except to do something really different.
Now, all of these ideas were very much a part of a culture of the court, And I think it's important to recognize that there was a very specific, very learned audience for these kinds of paintings.
And that's where he stopped. So going back to what you guys were talking about earlier with the blue Yves Klein painting, that was kind of a reaction to the realism that was happening. People wanted to do something different. So tomorrow we're actually going to continue talking about critics and how critics analyze paintings and other works of art. And we're also going to get into our mediums section. So part 2, we're going to start off with drawing, the most basic medium. So come prepared for that. Of course, keep in mind you do have your chapter quiz that you should be working on taking. And I will get that flashcard set posted by noon today. Okay. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, text me, whatever. Okay. I will get to you as quickly as possible. Everyone have a wonderful day.
That was good.
Bye, guys.